Maria Harris made significant contributions to the field of religious education. She was also an extraordinary person. As Gabriel Moran said in his eulogy for her, she evoked a reaction of joy, admiration, and love from so many people. This video offers some remembrances of Maria and one of her best-known works, Teaching and Religious Imagination.
When Maria talks about art, she says first you have to confront it and then you have to get some distance. I don't have much distance from this subject, which is an advantage and a disadvantage in commenting. I say in a sense we spent 39 years dialoguing about various subjects, and especially teaching, some of the successes we had and some of the failures. And when we first met, I was the teacher and she was the student. And I think for a while, she may have been too much under my direction, but it quickly became different, and we became co-teachers. And then in much of this, she became my teacher.
I knew Maria Harris. I knew her very, very well. I knew her intimately. I was still a Franciscan brother when she was still a sister of St. Joseph. We both worked out on Long Island for the Catholic Church, and we were part of the early group of people doing introducing sex education to the Catholic school system in Rockville Center, a very, very perilous sort of an enterprise given the traditions of restrictive attitudes towards sexuality and sexual ethics among Catholics historically. And for years after, throughout the decades of our friendship, Maria would refer to us as having first met doing sex on Long Island.
If I could use a sports metaphor to remember Maria. Maria for me was Wayne Gretzky on ice. The way that Gretzky played hockey, how he was so majestic on the ice, so skillful, and yet keeping his balance. Maria was Wayne Gretzky on ice for me. To use another sports metaphor, she was Michael Jordan on the basketball court, how he bobbed and weaved with such energy and power, and yet could stop, rest, and shoot. That was Maria. She was Michael Jordan on the basketball court. Or even a richer sports metaphor for me, she was Roger Federer on the tennis court. You know how Federer is so graceful, so skillful, just an artist on the tennis court.
Well, I was first introduced to Maria Harris's work when I was a grad student, and I have to thank Ted Brailsford for introducing me to her work. And it was such an important work in his course that I took from him that it became an important piece of work that I engaged in my dissertation work, and then became inspired to create a course that was inspired by the pedagogy that she describes in the book. Especially the second half of the book where she talks about the aesthetic and the religious imagination and her experience of working with Mary Tully. So when I was hired by Boston University School of Theology, I had negotiated to teach this course, and the course was would be called Doing Theology Aesthetically. And so the pedagogy of the course had Maria Harris in mind. And so I was excited to teach this course. It had a very heavy experiential component. So about half the course would be engaging theory and half the course would be making art. And so I ended up using the book both in actually two courses. I ended up using it in doing theology aesthetically and another course called creative pedagogy.
In my 72 years, I think that Maria Harris was the most fully formed sacramental person I know. And that's a function of looking and looking and looking, right? How does she begin? She begins teaching in religious imagination, citing Wallace Stevens, it must be possible, it is possible, it is possible, it must be possible. The sacramental person is someone who looks until they see the possibilities, and the divine in the human, the transcendent in the historical, to etc., etc., the grace inside the human being, the richness inside of objects, and so on and so forth. And this is why her gift to us about teaching, beginning with seeing, outfitting yourself with the skill set of seeing more carefully, looking until you see everything and all the richness and all the value that's there, is so important. She begins this by saying, first of all, the imaginative teacher has to form themselves and ask others to help them to be a contemplative. And the first moment of teaching with imagination is the contemplative moment, and then the form-giving moment, and the allowing things to emerge, and then allowing things to release.
Don't approach the text with a consumerist attitude, to be used. Don't approach it as a product or to be mastered. Okay? Read it contemplatively. Read it restfully. Read it receptively. And be open to change your mind, and be open to change your teaching practices as a result of your reading.
So in approaching the book, I would say to notice at the very beginning of the book, she says this is an essay on teaching.
I think the most significant and meaningful contribution of the text is its philosophy of teaching. Maria basically wants a new starting point for speaking about teaching, to move away from starting with teaching as a set of methods and techniques. So she wants a new starting point for the whole discussion and imagination of teaching.
You know, I think my students have really appreciated having some language that Maria Harris gives, especially in the models that she gives about teaching and embodying pedagogy in ways that could be helpful for their own ministry. And it's been really helpful for engaging students in how people can think theologically through art.
The issue of teaching with clay was certainly a surprise to me. When she first did that with these 50 and 60-year-olds, I thought some of them would rebel and say, I don't do that, that's too childish. But from my memory, they all just put both hands in there. She always gave them plenty of clay to work with. I used to carry it. I strained my back once in carrying 25 pounds of clay. But people dove right in, and they got quickly what she was talking about in her steps about an aesthetic process in teaching, that with the clay, one has to engage it, and then one has to look for shape or form, and sort of let your fingers do it. One of the things that strikes me, I never asked her this, but the book Teaching and Religious Imagination says a lot about different arts, but it does not say much about music. And I always think of Maria as completely enveloped in music. and that her ideas of rhythm and form go back to her musical background. When I was watching President Obama give his eulogy in Charleston, this is in June, as many people said, I thought it was the most brilliant speech that he ever gave, and that he shocked really the audience, the 5,000 people there, when he broke into song at the end. Maria used to do that. The first time she did it, I don't think it was planned. And I told her, boy, that was great. You should have seen the way the whole audience was electrified. So I encouraged her to do it, and she did it regularly.
Maria, I believe, has made a unique, original contribution to the field of religious education. And I think I could enumerate 3 or 4 areas in which she has made that distinctive, unique contribution. The first would be that Maria brought a distinctive artistic lens to the field of religious education. Okay? Not just the use of the arts in religious education, but to imagine, to see the field, okay, artistically. I think she made a significant contribution in enabling us to what I would call reconceptualizing curriculum. Okay? Curriculum not just, particularly in her book, Fashioning a People. Okay? Curriculum not being narrowly confined to printed texts or visual resources, okay? But curriculum as a set of practices. So her reconceptualizing curriculum as a set of practices, the practice of worship, the practice of proclamation, the practice of koinonia, the practice of outreach and service, okay? And the practice of teaching or didache. The third point that I would make her unique contribution was, I think she brought, and this became more explicit in her later works, but a distinctive feminist perspective to the whole field.
I should mention that her most powerful influence, I think, was on women in the field, that she changed the imagination of women about their own identity and about their place in the field. She grew up in an era just as the feminist movement was really swinging into gear in the 1960s. And she became an ardent spokesperson on such things. She used to speak to high school faculties, for example, and the women really appreciated what she would talk about. I think she expanded the very image of what religious education is. To many people, it may have seemed she wasn't dealing with religious education when she was dealing with workshops on the Holocaust or something. But she conceived of that as all part of an educator's dealing with the religious in human life. All I can say personally is I didn't know how to teach until I was about 60 years old. I learned a lot of what I knew about teaching from Maria. In fact, I learned a lot about living from her. I learned from her to go into a classroom and stand there at the door and think, now why are these people sitting here? What can I possibly do? What do they bring here to this moment? And I learned to not go into a classroom and start talking, but to go into a classroom and ask students, invite, and get something out on the table between us before we started at all. I think that's a very important lesson for all professionals to deal with, and especially in a classroom. So she was just part of my life and still is.
I think Maria was the most fully formed Catholic that I've ever known, and I don't mean principally or primarily that she was baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. I mean that she was someone who embodied what do the words literally mean in Greek? Kataholos, literally kataholos, with respect to the whole. And I think that expands legitimately to saying Catholic, not being a Catholic, but being Catholic in one's ideology, in one's way of being, valuing, and practicing being a human being, is to, as far as possible, see and then embrace and invite and celebrate everything and everyone. So Maria Harris, teaching and religious imagination, cultivating this sacramental perspective, cultivating this Catholic perspective, not in an ecclesial sense, but in a deep existential human sense. Maria Harris.
One of the things that happened when I first arrived at the Boston Theological Institute, of which Maria Harris was a part when she was at Andover Newton, was when in my first year I was with a poetics group, and I met Bob Pazmino, and I had introduced myself, and I was telling him how proud I was and how grateful I was to bringing this work back to the BTI, and knowing that this was where Maria Harris had taught and she had done this work. And so I felt like in some ways I was carrying on her work. And the next time that the group met, he kindly gave me a copy of her syllabi, and one of them was her original syllabi of the aesthetic and religious education course. And I just felt like the sky opened up and I was receiving this copy of her original syllabus that she talks about in the book. So I've been inspired and very grateful for what she had been doing, but also the way that my students continue to engage that work, and we are carrying that work forward.